Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a source manual that honestly is quite different from any trading guide you've likely come across before. We're unpacking the Ghosts of Trading a Field manual for trading sovereignty. And our mission today, just to be clear, is really to skip the usual stuff, the charts, the indicators, macroeconomic forecast, all of that. This manual, it focuses entirely, exclusively on the internal side of things, building mental structure, that kind of ironclad emotional discipline and real clarity. It offers a system, a whole system, designed to replace that internal chaos. You know, that feeling of being completely swept away by fear or greed with something predictable, a repeatable way to self-correct.
Exactly. And that's why we really need to look at this material through a much wider lens than just trading. We're not just analyzing techniques for market performance here. We are diving deep, really deep, into the actual blueprint for what you might call internal sovereignty itself. What's absolutely fundamental here, I think, is the author's argument that these deep, corrosive distortions that sabotage financial performance, things like fear, greed, impatience, denial.
Usual suspects.
Right, the usual suspects. They argue these are the exact same psychological forces that undermine leadership, that destabilize relationships, and really just compromise our stability in everyday life. So this manual is more like a comprehensive framework for psychological endurance, especially under pressure.
Okay, so let's unpack this blueprint then. We're going to cover the core metaphor, the main structure they call the keep the trader's inner fortress. Then we'll get into the four distinct layers of these ghosts, these internal distortions they name. And finally, we'll break down the, well, it seems simple but profound, repeatable ritual cycle they use to actively turn that internal chaos into real operational clarity. Surprisingly systematic approach to self-mastery, really. Let's start right there with that central metaphor, the keep. So in this system, the keep is, as you said, the trader's inner fortress. It's defined as this living, mental, almost spiritual structure, something that has to be continually, consciously built, maintained, and importantly, actively defended against internal attack.
Yes, and what's really essential about using that metaphor, the keep, is the absolute focus on structure. Structure as the replacement for just relying on willpower, which we know is unreliable. When the structure is solid, when the architecture is sound, discipline becomes almost the automatic default. It replaces that impulsive reaction. And the fortress, it's never really finished. It's built one law, one habit, one ritual at a time. The whole point is to build it so resiliently that when the market, or frankly any external pressure, lays siege.
The keep holds.
The keep holds. That's the goal.
That makes perfect sense. Because if you're just relying on how you feel on a Tuesday morning, well, you're kind of doomed from the start, right?
Yeah.
But if the law is literally written into the architecture, as you say, then the correct decision is sort of predetermined. Okay, so let's drill down. What are the structural elements? How is the keep actually built and defended? #tag components of the keep, the structural elements.
Right, so we start, fittingly, with the foundations. These are the tools you use immediately to center yourself, to align your focus, to stop the outside world just flooding your internal state. The manual really emphasizes the necessity of breath work and using what they call ritual cards. And these aren't just, suggestions for relaxation techniques. No, they are the immediate physical and mental mechanism you use to dissolve the noise, establish your rhythm, and get that internal alignment before you do anything high stakes. Think of them as the first line of defense, the initial barricade.
Okay, foundations center us. Then we need boundaries. That sounds like the walls. And these are manifested as the skeleton laws. But hang on, doesn't every trader think they have non-negotiable rules?
Yeah.
What makes these skeleton laws structurally different from just, I don't know, a list of do-nots that people tend to ignore when the pressure's really on?
That's a really crucial distinction. A simple list of do-nots is often just aspirational, isn't it? Something you hope you'll follow. The skeleton laws in this system are absolute, rigid boundaries. They are non-negotiable because breaking one triggers an immediate, automatic structural failure of the keep itself. They define the absolute limits of engagement. For example, a skeleton law might be very specific. I never risk more than X% of my capital on any single trade, period. Or it might be something like, I do not trade if I haven't followed my sleep schedule.
Okay, that's strict.
It is. And if those walls are breached, the operation stops immediately. Because the system itself has been compromised, it doesn't matter if you are making money or losing money at that moment. They create a real structural consequence for any emotional failure to follow the law.
So the consequence isn't just financial loss, it's systemic. The breach is the failure. Okay, and if the walls are the rigid defense, then the gates serve a different function. You mentioned intelligence, self-correction. This is the ghost ledger.
Yes, the ghost ledger. And this concept is, well, frankly, brilliant. It forces immediate awareness, but crucially, it's non-punitive awareness. Think of it less like a diary where you beat yourself up, and more like an airplane's black box, the flight recorder. It doesn't judge the crash, it just logs the data, the objective data needed so the next flight can be safer. The ledger is where every single emotional slip-up, every temporal distortion, every ghost is immediately named, categorized, and logged, clinically, detached. It transforms what felt like a momentary emotional failure into actionable empirical data, because you really can't fix what you refuse to name and record.
That reframing is absolutely key, isn't it? It stops that primal ghost of shame from grabbing hold. If you just treat the failure like, okay, administrative task, log, it loses some of that emotional power.
Exactly right. And then finally, you have the highest parts of the structure, the towers and archives. These represent the templates and the journals. This is where the wisdom, the learning actually accumulates. The archives are where the transmutation happens. The raw data from the ghost ledger, the failures, the corrections that worked it, gets processed, recorded, and transformed into a lasting pearl of wisdom, as the manual calls it. This is the system's feedback loop for learning. The towers, as the physical sort of representation, they signify that higher perspective you gain over time. They let the trader look back, review the history of their internal battles, and make sure that structural breaches are genuinely learned from, internalized, and hopefully not repeated. So the keep isn't static, it's an active engine for continuous self-refinement.
Okay, so the keep gives us the structure, the architecture. But like you said, a fortress needs more than just walls. It needs a way to operate, a defense mechanism. And that's the ritual cycle. This is the dynamic system of defense and repair. How does someone actually use this fortress to fight back when, say, fear or greed shows up?
Right, the ritual cycle is the engine. It's the mechanism that takes that raw, chaotic emotion and converts it into a predictable, structured response. And doing that repeatedly is what ultimately builds that genuine self-sovereignty. It's a 5-stage loop, and it has to be practiced until it's almost automatic, like muscle memory, a systemic pivot back to the skeleton laws. So stage 1 is always recognize the ghost. You have to identify it. That active identification stops the unconscious, automatic reaction in its tracks. You have to immediately name that specific distortion. Is this impatience I'm feeling? Is it regret bubbling up? You just acknowledge its presence. Okay, that's step 1. Stage 2. Breathe to dissolve reaction. This is where you deploy the foundations we talked about. Using that focused breathwork literally buys you essential mental space. It stops you from taking the immediate impulsive action the ghost is screaming at you to take.
That's the pause button, which sounds simple, but it's absolutely critical, non-negotiable even. Because without that gap, that space between the stimulus and your response, the next stages just aren't possible, are they?
Completely impossible. Correct. So stage 3. Declare the law. This is the active part of recentering yourself. You immediately state the relevant counter law, which is a short declarative command to pull your internal posture back into alignment with the non-negotiable structure of the keep. Then, stage 4. Act only when alignment is clear. Now, this is the moment where you validate the structural integrity. The trader must wait, sometimes it's minutes, maybe even hours, for their internal state, their posture, to align completely with the skeleton law before they execute any action, no matter what.
Okay, that 4th stage sounds deceptively difficult. It requires really sitting on your hands doing nothing, even when the market, or maybe life, is screaming at you to move.
Yeah.
Now, that's a huge test of patience.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine the market just made a sharp move against your position. Your alignment is suddenly cloudy, right? Primal fear is shouting, get out now.
Yeah.
Even though your specific skeleton law says you wait for, say, a confirmation pattern to complete. Clarity means sitting there, maybe for 15 minutes, maybe longer, doing the breath work, declaring the law until the law's specific prerequisite is met. And if that prerequisite isn't met, you don't act. Simple as that. And then finally, stage 5. Log the event and the lesson in the ledger. This closes the loop. It ensures the whole cycle, the ghost you identified, the correction you applied, the law you enforced, gets recorded in the gates and archives.
Let's talk a bit more about those counter laws. They seem key to stage 3. You said there's short declarations, mental anchors. They feel almost aggressively simple.
They're designed that way. They have to be simple enough to cut through the thickest emotional fog. They act like self-administered commands that instantly recalibrate your system. They bypass all the internal debate and justification. For instance, a counter law like, quote, I do not chase more. I take only what law gives. That immediately shuts down the primal ghost of greed by declaring self-restraint as the highest principle right now.
Powerful.
Or consider this one, quote, I do not second-guess law. I anchor in clarity. That just dissolves doubt or regret. It demands you trust the structure you already built when you were clear. And another good one, quote, "I release when law says release." This tackles that really insidious sovereign ghost of attachment head on, enforcing emotional detachment from the outcome.
Okay, but going back to the logging part, stage 5. If we're constantly logging failures, or maybe distortions is a better word, the times we don't achieve perfect clarity, how does the manual make sure the Ghost Ledger stays data-driven and genuinely non-punitive? How do you stop that cycle from just reinforcing shame?
That is absolutely central to the whole philosophy of this system. The ledger must be treated like a scientific instrument, a tool. It is explicitly not a moral scorecard. Violating a law isn't framed as a personal failing. It's identified as a structural weakness in the keep that needs reinforcement. That's it. The very act of logging it, honestly and without judgment, is itself the first step of the counter solution for shame, because it is the act of speaking the truth about what happened. And by immediately processing that experience into a pearl of wisdom in the archives, like we discussed, the failure gets transmuted. It becomes a permanent, valuable asset that actually strengthens your internal posture for the future. This whole system is about building resilience, the ability to take a hit, self-correct, and keep going. It's not about chasing some fragile, impossible state of perfection.
Okay, this leads us nicely into the real meat of the internal conflict mapping. The manual lays out this expensive taxonomy of what goes wrong inside. And it asserts that trading, and really any high-stakes activity, isn't primarily a battle against the market or external factors, but it's a disciplined war against distortion itself.
Exactly. And this is where the market, or whatever your field is, truly becomes a mirror. If you see chaos, erratic behavior, volatility on the outside, it's very often a direct reflection of some internal breakdown, some ghost operating unchecked within your keep. Understanding these 4 distinct layers allows you, the practitioner, to immediately categorize, name, and then apply the precisely correct counter law during that ritual cycle we just talked about. So we really need to dive into each layer, because this is the core psychological architecture the manual offers.
Okay, let's start at the bottom, the deepest psychological layer, the primal ghosts. These are described as the raw, visceral, emotional roots. They manifest as these distinct, often overwhelming internal voices constantly trying to push you off balance. And the list is pretty comprehensive. Fear, greed, doubt, shame, pride, despair, temptation, abandonment, betrayal, and collapse. Wow.
Yeah, they are the foundational forces, and they have to be addressed structurally. You can't just suppress them or wish them away. They need to be actively counteracted by a principle embedded in the keep. Take fear, for example. It doesn't dissolve just because you want it to. It dissolves through structural clarity. You counteract the uncertainty of fear with defined written law. So if fear strikes mid-trade, you immediately check your skeleton laws. Is this trade still aligned with my rules? Yes. Okay. Then your action is dictated by the law, not by the feeling of fear.
Using the structure to override the feeling.
Precisely. And similarly, greed is countered through, well, radical restraint, that conscious declaration, I take only what law gives. That means sticking rigidly to the profit targets you defined before you even entered the trade and deliberately ignoring the siren call of maybe grabbing a bit more. And what's really interesting is how they handle pride. Pride often crops up after a winning streak, right? And it demands reckless behavior, thinking you've suddenly got it all figured out. The counter solution is what they call aggressive humility, actively recognizing the market's complete indifference to your ego and immediately forcing yourself back to the mechanical application of your laws, stripping away that emotional high from the win.
That counter solution for shame seems particularly relevant, especially connecting back to the ghost ledger. You said it dissolves through truth. How does that actually look in practice? Maybe for one of our listeners, say, in a leadership role who just made a really costly mistake.
Great question. In any domain, shame paralyzes you. It stops learning dead in its tracks. The truth solution is deceptively simple but hard to do. Acknowledge the structural failure immediately. Log it, maybe not in a trading ledger, but in a journal, or even just mentally noting it objectively without judgment. Declare the lesson learned and move on. It means actively refusing to wallow in that emotional paralysis. Just state the facts, learn, proceed. And for despair, that awful feeling that you failed completely, that you're structurally broken, the cure prescribed is sheer endurance. It's the immediate commitment to return to your law, your process, from the very next action, regardless of how big the previous loss or failure was. The keep must be repaired, not abandoned.
Okay, moving up a layer. Layer 2 brings us to the temporal ghosts. These are all about messing with your rhythm, your timing. These distortions cause you to act either too early or too late, which obviously compromises precise execution. The list here includes things like hesitation, impatience, Impulse, early entry, late entry, getting stopped out prematurely, the stop clip, late exit, urgency, messing with tempo, time bias, and that classic reversalitis.
Yes, these ghosts directly attack the execution phase. They create friction between your intended plan, your law, and the messy reality of the market unfolding in time. Impulse and early entry, for instance, are often driven by greed or maybe FOMO, fear of missing out, while late exit and the stop clip are usually driven by attachment to the position or fear of realizing a loss. That stop clip specifically is a perfect example of a structural breach. It's when the trader bails out of a trade that is still technically within the parameters of their skeleton law purely because a momentary price dip induced fear.
They react to the noise, not the signal defined by the law.
Exactly. The core problem with all these temporal ghosts is that you end up obeying the emotional pressure of time, that feeling of hurry up or wait, maybe longer, rather than obeying the disciplined boundaries of your structure. Reversalitis is a great example, constantly seeing potential reversals everywhere, anticipating the market turning against you. It leads to jumpy, poor exits and entries, a complete betrayal of your planned, structured approach.
And the core law the manual gives for tackling all these temporal distortions is, I thought, really insightful. You don't obey time, you obey structure.
Precisely. And if you think about applying that more broadly, say in project management, like you mentioned earlier, you don't just suddenly accelerate a timeline because stakeholders are feeling urgent. No, you obey the structured law of the established process, the realistic milestones. In trading, you match the market's rhythm through patience, through precise timing based only on your predefined rules, like waiting for a specific candle pattern to close, for example, and using that centering breath work, not through frantic reaction. The real mastery here is developing the patience to let the market come to you, to conform to your structural rules rather than constantly trying to bend your rules to fit the market's momentary noise.
All right, layer 3 takes us into the mind itself, the cognitive ghosts. These apparently live purely in our thoughts and perceptions, actively skewing how we see reality or maybe ignoring our own internal truth. The manual lists quite a few here, too. Regret, comparison, overconfidence, perfectionism, false victory, mimicry, hypocrisy, denial, drift, lineage, that's an interesting one, and silence.
These ghosts tend to hold you captive mentally, either stuck replaying the past or lost in some idealized, unrealistic future. Regret, obviously, keeps you looping on past losses or mistakes, distracting you completely from the present opportunities right in front of you. Comparison is huge, constantly judging your own performance against others, often based on, curated social media feeds or whatever. That immediately breaches the necessary structural independence of your own keep. And perfectionism that can paralyze action entirely for fear of making any error, which, ironically, is itself a structural failure because it stops you from executing your own laws.
That idea of false victory sounds particularly insidious. How can winning actually sabotage your internal structure?
Yeah, false victory is dangerous.
Yeah.
It's that arrogance that can bloom after a successful streak, but a streak that wasn't actually driven by strict adherence to your laws. Maybe it was just luck or market conditions happened to favor your style for a bit. It starts to convince the trader that maybe the laws are, for beginners, for the less successful, that they don't need them anymore. And that leads immediately to drift, another ghost on the list, the slow abandonment of the foundations, the walls, the ritual cycle. It's a cognitive blind spot that almost always precedes a major systemic failure down the line.
Right, the discipline starts to fray.
Exactly. And then you mentioned silence refusing to speak lessons aloud, or maybe just refusing to record them honestly in the ghost ledger. This one is maybe the most insidious because if you don't log the failure, if you keep it secret even from yourself, you completely prevent the entire system from self-correcting. You break the feedback loop. So the cure for these cognitive ghosts is really relentlessly enforced awareness and declaration. You have to confront the mental distortion, name it, declare the written truth of your law, and refuse to let your mind dwell there. Hypocrisy, for instance, is cured simply by enforcing your own whilst actually living up to the skeleton laws you set for yourself, not just paying lip service to them.
Okay, this is where, for me, the deep dive gets really profound. Layer 4. The sovereign ghosts. These are described as the final, most insidious layer. And the reason is, they don't usually attack the beginner. They tend to appear only after you've started achieving some consistent progress, some success. They're framed as the ultimate test of the longevity and the true independence of your internal structure. The list includes entropy, complacency, attachment, martyrdom, arrogance, and distraction.
Yes, these ghosts challenge the very heart of sovereignty itself. They basically ask the question, can your keep stand strong without needing constant external validation or excitement? Can the law be maintained even when it feels unnecessary or maybe even a bit boring? Entropy, for instance, is described as that slow, subtle decay in adhering to your laws. It's not a sudden dramatic breach of the walls, it's the quiet decision to maybe skip the breath work just this one morning, or tolerating a small violation of a rule because, hey, it worked out okay this time. This gradual neglect introduces systemic instability over time, and complacency is entropy's natural partner. It's the creeping belief that your success is now somehow permanent, and that the daily grind, the effort required to maintain the walls and perform the rituals, is no longer really needed for you. This ghost directly attacks the foundations and the ritual cycle itself.
That's such a classic leadership trap, too, isn't it? You see successful organizations become slow, rigid, maybe bureaucratic after years of dominance because they simply stopped fearing internal decay. They got complacent.
Exactly the same dynamic. The manual insists that sustained sovereignty, whether personal or organizational, requires constant vigilance, particularly against attachment. In trading, attachment is that emotional tie to a specific position, a specific outcome, or even a specific idea about the market. The truly sovereign trader, according to this model, is actually indifferent to the outcome of any single event. Their attachment is only to the integrity of their process, to the law itself. Becoming attached to an external result is seen as a fundamental surrender of your internal independence.
And arrogance, in this context, sounds like the ultimate rejection of the entire system, the final stage before collapse.
It really is. Arrogance replaces the humility that's required for continuous learning and adaptation with a dangerous belief in your own personal infallibility. It means you start elevating your own fleeting judgment above the established written law of your keep, which is, by definition, structural collapse waiting to happen. These sovereign ghosts fundamentally challenge whether the trader or the leader can remain steady, disciplined, and independent without needing constant positive reinforcement or drama. This level of self-mastery demands that the structure holds firm even when, especially when, the results are just boringly consistent because the process is working. So if we try to bring all these threads together now, connect it back to the bigger picture. The source material argues quite powerfully, I think, that when your internal posture is genuinely aligned with your clear, non-negotiable laws, then the external outcomes tend to follow much more naturally. The internal state effectively dictates the external result. It makes the keep, your internal structure, the primary factor, almost regardless of how complex or chaotic the external market or environment might seem.
And this is really where the manual completely transcends the world of finance. Even though it's called the ghost of trading, its potential for universal application is maybe its greatest strength. As we've kind of touched on throughout, the exact same distortions, greed, impatience, denial, complacency, they show up everywhere, ubiquitously. I mean, listeners in leadership roles will immediately recognize greed as maybe the force pushing them to overextend company resources, or denial as that inability to acknowledge a strategy just isn't working. And the core genius here, I think, is that the rituals themselves are universally transferable. Naming the ghost, identify the distortion that's showing up in the meeting room, or maybe at the dinner table, or during a tense negotiation. Breathing to dissolve the reaction, consciously creating that vital space before you respond emotionally or impulsively. Logging the lesson, making a concrete commitment to a structural improvement in your approach or behavior, and consistently returning to your established law, whatever behavioral standards or principles you set for yourself. These same steps can restore balance absolutely anywhere that discipline is tested.
Absolutely. And furthermore, the system is actually designed to encourage transmission, to be passed on. The manual suggests that the trader, or anyone who achieves a level of mastery through this process, inherently becomes a teacher, almost by default. And their field, their community, becomes their clan. Knowledge, specifically the structure of the keep and the counter laws that work, gets shared, reinforced collectively, and that strengthens the sovereignty of the entire group. It implies that learning and growth aren't just solitary pursuits, they become systemic and communal when done right.
And that really summarizes the entire philosophy at the heart of this source material, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When fear or greed or doubt inevitably return because they are just part of being human, they will always return. The approach isn't to try and fight them head on, which is usually a losing battle anyway. Instead, you name them, you use the breathwork to find that space, and you immediately consciously pivot back to the clear written law of your keep. That unwavering commitment to a repeatable ritual over a raw emotional response. That is the definition of trading sovereignty, or maybe just sovereignty, period.
Which brings us to a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive. The manual explicitly teaches that the ultimate goal of building this entire internal architecture, the keep, is not achieving some elusive, fragile state of perfection, which is itself just another cognitive trap, the ghost of perfectionism. No, the real goal is resilience. Building the structural capacity for your keep to absorb any impact, internal or external, automatically initiate that ritual cycle, self-correct using the ghost ledger feedback loop, and remain standing firm, ready for the next action aligned with law.
So you now have the blueprints, the comprehensive overview for the keep. You understand its core components, the foundations, the walls, the gates, the archives, and the crucial 5 steps of the ritual cycle. You've heard about the 4 layers of distortion, from those deep primal fears all the way up to the subtle tests of sovereign complacency. When the chaos threatens your clarity, the response is simple. Name the ghost, breathe, and return to law.
That's how chaos becomes clarity. That's treating sovereignty.
And the key